Welcome back to My BrainWise Coach. I'm Bastian, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon. If you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking that's not what I meant, or why don't they ever listen, this episode is for you. Because we're going to dive into the art and science of effective dialogue. Today, we're going to cover the three components of dialogue, the attention spectrum, and the brain's barriers to connection. But Phil, take us a couple clicks further into those three particular bullet points, the three core components of dialogue, the attention spectrum, and barriers to connection. What are some expected outcomes our listeners might receive from listening to those three topics?
First of all, there are skills that you can develop in each of those areas. How do we ask questions? We can actually get better at it. How do we get better at getting our point across so that we're actually heard? And that's all about tonality and brevity. And then how can we become better listeners? Because when we are listening, there's all sorts of things going on. And in fact, the balance between all those three things is an incredible dance. It's been called the biological dance. So it goes back and forth. So the first thing is, those are the three main components. When you talk about dialogue or conversations, it doesn't become any more than that. It's three things. And I think people think that there's a lot to going on in dialogue. No, it's just those three things. So that's point number one. And if you can become better at each of those, then you're going to find your life is just generally better, whether you're a leader or you're at home. The second thing is the attention spectrum. Is the first part about listening is, are you paying attention? Sorry to be so simple and blunt, but that's really what it is. And then the third part we're going to go into is, what's getting in the way of being an effective listener or an effective speaker or whatever? Because we've talked a lot about the non-conscious. There's a lot of it going on in the non-conscious, which is actually going to get in your way. So the point of today is to improve your effectiveness in understanding what the three parts of dialogue are about, but particularly we're going to focus in how can you become a better listener.
And then we'll have a series. The next couple of episodes are going to be focused on the other parts, right? Asking great questions, and then how do we communicate or how do we tell information with better brevity, succinctness, and being more effective in being able to do that. So it's going to be a series of episodes where we're going to go into this, but I think it's a really good topic to have, or a good conversation, especially when we look at where we are in today's society and where we are at work or whether we're at home. With the introduction of technology and social media and all of the different aspects that we interact with on a daily basis, it has, in my personal opinion, decreased overall all of our ability to be effective communicators, because we don't practice it as frequently, or we're practicing it through a vehicle or a medium that isn't as intuitive or isn't as personal as being one-on-one or with a group of people, because we're doing it through technology. And it's just some of the components are the same, but it's just a different experience overall. So why don't we dive into and talk about the three components of effective dialogue? And why don't we talk a little bit first on where people stumble in effective dialogue, whether it's in asking, telling, listening, and then we can go into what are some tidbits they can take out of that so that they don't stumble along that journey.
Let's start off with asking. We've talked about very quickly. We'll go through this. It sets it up for the next couple of episodes. But asking questions, if you ask, so let's you and I play for a moment, right?
Sure.
I'm going to see whether I can find out where you went. I'm going to use closed-ended questions to start with, and then I'm going to ask open-ended questions, and we'll do a comparison. And I've got an objective in my mind, but I won't tell you. Did you go on vacation last year? Did you go to America?
Yes.
Was it the East Coast?
No.
Was it the West Coast?
Yes.
Was it west of the Mississippi?
Yes.
All right. Now I can keep going down. Those are closed-ended questions that I'm driven by yes, no. Closed-ended questions can also mean when, where did you go, and things like that. Monosyllabic answers tend to be...
Right.
And I could get there, but it takes a long time. It takes a lot of effort on behalf of the questioner to get to an end result. And it's never very rich. Let's try again.
Okay.
All right. How was your holiday last year?
It was really nice. We had a good time.
Where'd you go?
We went to Maui, Hawaii.
Wow. What did you like most about Maui?
Was for our honeymoon, and we spent time together by ourselves as a couple and enjoyed the beauty and wonder of God's creation. And specifically, there were several activities, but one was the road to Hana. And that's, for those who are unfamiliar, you're driving on this real narrow side of road on the side of a mountain through the jungle of Hawaii, and it was just absolutely breathtaking. And there also was limited cell phone reception. And so it really forced Joey and I to spend one-on-one time together because we couldn't communicate with the outside world. And so there was this app that you download so that you can at least know where to go since you're not going to have any service over there. And it navigated you through all the different stops along the journey and where to get the best banana bread and all kinds of stuff. So it was super fun. And it was such an intimate experience with Joey.
So I'm going to stop us there. So first of all, I want to point out how much richer the second set of questions were than the first. It's a lot easier to get to the richness of conversation by asking open-ended questions. Now, you gave me a long answer there, which is great. And I have a choice. I can either keep listening and ask you more questions, or I can tell you something. Right? So what's more useful to the conversation? Me asking you more depth or me telling you something?
Probably getting more depth. And I think it promotes relatability. It promotes connection between two people. If you think about the part that kind of dawned on me, Phil, between the first set of questions that you asked and the second, where you did closed versus open-ended, is that the first was a bit more cold and stoic in nature. And the second was warmer, it was more intense. And if you were listening with intention of understanding where I'm coming from, it's creating relatability, it's creating a connection that we wouldn't have had on the front end of the questions.
Yeah. So I can now go into, I'm listening, but I'm actually going to do a response and then a question. Mm-hmm. And so the response was, it sounds like that road to Hana was beautiful. I've been down there, but it's incredible. What else did you notice about that road?
What was your favorite part of going on? What was your favorite part along that
So
journey?
there's all sorts of what questions. There's all sorts of how questions. And those are the most powerful when you're starting to ask questions. And we will come back to this in our second episode. But I just wanted to illustrate how it's a dance between asking, telling, and listening.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good. And I think when we think of some of the stumbling blocks that people have is when we go along this journey with our BrainWise friends, Phil, over the next several episodes, is when in communication, at least from my perspective, a very simple way of thinking of it is, are you coming to the conversation to be understood or to understand someone else's perspective? And you can have a balance of both, right? There can be a balance of both in a conversation. But if your intention when you go into a conversation, I'm going to specifically use in with your spouse or your significant other, to simply be understood without understanding where they might be coming from, that could be where you're having a lot of stumbling blocks or barriers to successful dialogue. Because in a relationship, there's always three parts to every story or every experience: my experience, your experience, and then the truth, right? Or the reality of what happened. But if I only approach the dialogue from my own perspective versus seeking to understand where someone else is coming from, it's going to create some barriers between the two of us, which we're going to get into in the third part of today. But I just wanted to share that is a common stumbling block and it's not even always intentional, but it's in how we show up, that I only really care about my perspective. I'm not all that interested in yours. And it's because of how we're asking questions or how we're showing up in the dialogue.
And one of the things about listening that tends to happen is we're scared of silence. So if I'm listening to you and you pause, my natural inclination is to jump in. Now, I might give you a half a second, I might give you a second, but more likely most people give you about a millisecond before they jump in. And you go, well, I wasn't done. I was just taking a breath. And so there's that whole process of being aware of when you are listening. If somebody takes a deep breath, let them take the deep breath. Because one of the things science knows, if I ask you a question and you come up with an answer, the first answer you're going to give me is the easy one. right?
Mm-hmm.
It may not be the one that's most on your mind, because that's going to come out if I ask a second or maybe a third question or even a fourth question. And if you think of it as when you respond on that, I had my trip, the road to Hana. I've got a choice now. If I ask you a question, I can either explore what else did you do when you were on the road to Hana, or what else did you do when you were in Maui?
Right.
Or I can go in depth and go, tell me more about that trip, or tell me more about the road to Hana. What did you
Mhm.
find when you got there? And so if you think of it, it's almost like a spreadsheet. You can either go across all the columns or you can go down the rows. And
Right.
that's the sort of matrix of how you might think about asking questions as follow up.
I think as we go into the follow up part, the difference is, are we having a conversation because we truly want to listen to the response, or we're actually just waiting to talk again?
Yeah.
And I think that goes into the pausing, which we talk about in facilitation, or just a general conversation. When you ask a question, you should pause for 7 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. 7 is a really good number. And if you ever want a really good example of listening versus talking, go into a bar and watch two guys exchange telling jokes. Right? And what happens? The first guy tells a joke. What's the second guy doing?
Listening ish.
Ish. What's actually going on in the back of his mind is, how can I come up with a better joke that I can give back?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Trying to one up each other.
That's exactly it. And as opposed to having the joy and the luxury of listening to somebody. So let's dig into, what does it mean to listen?
Right.
Should we go down that track for a while?
Yeah, let's do that. And right before we do that, let's just summarize. The first bullet we were going to talk about was, what are the 3 components of effective dialogue, or the art and science of dialogue? And those are asking questions, relaying or telling information, and then listening. And I would even put the word effective or active listening in front of it. And those are the 3 components. And so that's an overview. We talked about close-ended, open-ended questions. We talked about relaying information in a succinct or brevity style way. And then obviously now we're going to dive into probably one of the more important and more difficult parts, which is effective or active listening. And then we'll come back in successive episodes and talk about the other 2. So let's dive into listening and what it actually means.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a rider on what you just said and have our BrainWise friends actually become aware of what it is in their own personal dance between those 3 things, and where do they spend the bulk of their time.
And if I can add on to it, once you've identified that, if you feel comfortable, type it into the comments of the video and tell us, which one do you feel like you spend the most time in, and which one do you feel like you're the most effective in? And type it in the comments. And if you're not comfortable doing it in the comments, send us an email at questions@mybrainwisecoach.com, because we'd love to understand where everyone's at.
Yeah. And so again, we're playing off of each other here. And one of the things is, where you spend your time and this, that, and the other. And how useful is that in terms of your engaging in successful dialogue and conversations? And if it's not useful, how would you amend that? Where would you go next? And we'll come back. We're going to come back to that in subsequent conversations. But let's take the first step into delving into a little more depth. That is, let's look at what's going on in terms of, when you're listening, how much attention are you paying? Right now, let's face it, we're in an artificial situation in that we are both acutely aware that we're going to pay attention to each other. You and I actually do a pretty good job when we're not being recorded at paying attention to each other.
Right.
My first question to our BrainWise listeners are, when you are listening to another person, how much attention are you actually paying?
And I think a good gauge of that, Phil, is, have any of our listeners been in a conversation where they were listening, they thought, air quotes, to the other person, but then they couldn't remember what they actually just said?
Yeah. And that's a great practice, by the way. And we run this in corporations where we have 2 people set up, and you say to somebody, come up with a topic that you're passionate about, and you're going to speak to it for 2 minutes. And then the person that you're partnering with has to listen and then repeat back to you in 1 minute what you said. And that sort of creates that level of attention that we need to be paying to each other. It's a fascinating exercise. Then you reverse the situations. So what I'm going to do is try and give everybody what I'm calling a spectrum of how to pay attention, or where you are paying attention or where you're not. And the left-hand end of the spectrum is that you are either accidentally or deliberately ignoring somebody, right? And that can be things like looking away, glancing over their shoulder. This guy here, our iPhones, constantly looking down at that. That's a message to the rest of the world that you're either ignoring them or you're pretending to pay attention. You and I have been in workshops where we're speaking and somebody's got their iPhone on their lap and they're pretending to listen, but their eyes are actually looking down, reading the text.
100%. And I want to say one thing. Let's be inclusive. We also have our Android BrainWise friends.
I apologize.
We might be iPhone users. We might have some of our Android friends. We actually have a mutual colleague who is an Android user. So it may be your Android. And I just want to add in, I was really good, Phil, and I didn't realize how I was very immature at the time, obviously, in high school. We didn't have smartphones, but we had those the dial phones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the buttons. And I was really good at putting it in my pocket and texting, because for those who are my age or older, they'll know what T9 word was, which was predictive text of that era. And I could text back to someone in my pocket while still looking forward.
I tell you what, I bet that's on your resume, isn't it, as a skill?
It is now, although T9 word is gone because we don't have those kinds of phones anymore. So it's unfortunately an unuseful skill, but I used to be able to do it. However, I was not listening to the person or the teacher or the instructor that I was actually in class with.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a quick apology, as for those of our listeners that don't know, I worked for Apple for 9 years, from 1980 to 1989. I started off in IT and then went to leadership development. And yes, for those of you who are questioning, I did work with Steve Jobs. And fire any questions you want, subscribe to us and then I'll answer you.
Exactly.
So having worked for them for 9 years like that, if you cup me, I bleed in 6 colors. So I apologize if I'm always iPhone oriented as opposed to agnostic.
No worries. No apology necessary. I have a feeling people are going to have questions about your experiences with Steve Jobs. Be prepared to have some questions over the next several episodes, I imagine.
Well, I will deflect some of them to my wife because she was Steve Jobs' first HR manager.
Perfect.
She has better stories than I do.
I love it.
So anyway, back to the question in mind is, so in the left-hand end of the spectrum is where you're paying 0% attention. You're ignoring what's going on. And the next level over, let's get up to 10 or 15% on the spectrum, where you're pretending to listen, which is when you've got the T9 in your pocket and you're looking at the teacher, but your eyes are glazed over. And then the next one is you're actually coming in and out. Is that you're focusing in attention for a little bit, and then you get either externally or internally distracted. And those are 2 different parts of the brain, by the way, where you might get internally distracted because what the teacher said caused you to think about something else. Right. And then you've got to actively bring your attention back, as opposed to an external distraction, which is a noise or a person that walks by that attracts your attention, or a rabbit runs past the window. And we're coming in and out. And those are all 3 that aren't particularly, they don't contribute to a great dialogue. They're giving the person that's talking a body language indication that you actually don't really care too much about what they're saying. So that's the, if you like, the left-hand side of the spectrum. The right-hand side of the spectrum now is we can do what we call, I'm going to divide this into 3, and it's 3 levels of reasonably good listening. The first one is what I'll call partial listening. The second one is what I'll call effective listening, often called active listening. And the third level is what I'll call masterful listening. And so we're now going to, unless you want to do any summaries, we can delve into that with a little more detail.
No, I think we should, because I think one of the challenges, especially on a personal context, when you're trying to listen, is what are all of those distractions? So there is a part of it, you have to be very intentful in active listening, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But then in addition to, one of the things we always recommend, and I always recommend to everyone, is especially when you know the conversation may get a little heated, it may get a bit more intense, or you really want to be focused, is how can you intentionally put yourself and your significant other or your friend or whomever it is you're talking to in an area that is as least distracting as possible. So there's no television on. There's no phones on it. They're not even on your person. They're somewhere else in maybe another room or whatever it is. We have 2 dogs, for example. So they serve as a distraction if my husband and I are trying to have a serious conversation. So let's put them in their apartment while we're going to have this conversation. And there's a variety of other things, but how can we intentionally remove some of those outside distractions? Because then we can, to some degree, we're at least setting ourselves up in the best way possible to have an effective conversation where we both can intentionally listen to the other person.
And so the construct that you're in or the environment that you're in is very important to those levels of distraction. But not only those which are called external factors for increasing the effectiveness of the conversation, but I'll call them internal factors as well. And that is, let's say I'm working for you and you call me into your office to have the conversation. What's going on in my brain?
I'm threatened, probably, because why am I in your office?
Yeah, as opposed to you coming into my space. So if you're going to initiate the conversation, then think about how that message comes across to the other person.
Right.
And so constructing the environment to better engage, better have a conversation. Right. There's an old adage in the workspace called, it was supposedly introduced by Hewlett-Packard, called managing by wandering around. Now, it's an interesting one because it was in the days when leadership and management was very hierarchical. So it was breakthrough in that the manager didn't sit in the corner office and have everyone go into them. And they introduced this concept of managing by walking around. However, what they didn't look at is if you're busy working at your desk and all of a sudden your boss arrives at your right hand, you look up and it's not, oh, that's wonderful that you're managing by walking around. It's, what the heck have I done wrong? I evolved that to another thing, which is instead of you walking around, managed by everyone else walking around, go and sit in the coffee room. People are walking into your space, and then you can engage them in a conversation. There's ways of reframing all of these things.
Right.
So anyway, back to the partial listening, effective listening, and masterful listening. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
So let's talk about partial one listening. And that is you're listening through what I'll call a self lens. And that is you're listening and asking questions. Your listening is triggering off your own thoughts, triggering off your own ideas, and to a certain degree, triggering off your own judgments. And so you're talking to me and I'm now going through, yeah, I've done that before. I've been there. I can do better than that. I know the answer to this question. I can jump in. I can give them some advice, whatever it might be.
And this is probably where I would assume some possibly defensive posture comes in. If the conversation is getting a bit more heated, how can I, based off what they're saying, defend myself in this conversation?
Absolutely. And the other thing, we start now going into the non-conscious, and we've talked about mental models. Non-conscious mental model is if I continue listening, this is a mental model that some people have, and that is if I continue listening and don't say anything, then you're going to assume I agree with you or some variation of that, as opposed to, no, I'm actually just listening. I'm going to wait to the end before I actually say anything. So again, I'd pause for our BrainWise listeners and go, when you're listening, what are the mental models that are running through your head?
And I think that one of the things that's important is, I don't know if it's a mental model for me or if it's an adopted belief that I have now, but is that two things can be true at the same time, right? And that if I'm having a conversation with my spouse and maybe we're not agreeing on something, it's okay that we don't agree. My job in the conversation is to understand where he's coming from and try to at least relate to his perspective. I may not agree, and that's entirely okay. And then his job is to do the same thing, is to listen to my perspective. Maybe he doesn't agree with what I'm saying, and that's okay too. But that we get to a place where, okay, we now understand each other's perspectives because two parallels can exist at the same time, and we can still move forward and have a delightful discussion.
Yeah. And how many times have you seen, either done or seen other people do this? And that is, somebody starts to talk and maybe illustrates a problem they have, and the person who's listening jumps straight in with a solution.
Always.
And the person who's initially talking said, I actually tried that and it didn't work. And then in that case, you should do this. I tried that too. If you waited till the end, you wouldn't have to come up with all of these failures in terms of offering ideas. Wait till the very end.
And sometimes people don't want a solution.
No.
And that's where empathy comes in. And I think just a quick side note is a lot of time, and it's not always the case, typically especially men in conversation want to provide solutions to whatever the problem is. They're somewhat wired in that way. And there's probably female counterparts that have a similar capacity. But when someone is describing something to you, especially if it's a challenge that they're experiencing or emotions that are showing up, they may not want a solution. They may not quite honestly care about the solution because they really just want to feel heard.
Yeah. And so one of the ways of doing that, feeling heard, is to say to them, what do you need from me? My best help. What do you
Exactly.
Any of those type of questions, which are, I'll call them neutral based questions, rather than immediately jumping into the rescuer or solution provider, or I'm going to be a hero because I can give you the answer that you'd never even thought of. They're all background mental models that we all have at various stages.
Right. And you could always ask too, especially if you're not sure, and it's okay to be unsure of what that part of the dialogue is about, but is to say, are you looking for me to provide solutions, or do you want me to listen and empathize? It's 1000%, especially on the front end of one's journey of building great listening skills, to ask that question.
Yeah.
Because it helps you put yourself into the frame of mind that, okay, I'm here to listen. Or, oh no, they're actually looking for solutions. And now it becomes more of a brainstorming session.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get onto brain-based brainstorming one of these days. But what I'd encourage our listeners to do is take this package of questions that we've done and find their own way of asking open-ended questions and raise the quotient, the ratio of open-ended questions that you're asking.
And I think one of the ways, Phil, for our BrainWise friends to measure, are you being successful in practicing your listening skills when asking those open-ended questions, is can you summarize in your own words with 75% of the time success rate based off of what the other person's actual communication or conversation was? Can you summarize the bullet points 75% of the time effectively? And if you can, you're probably getting to a place where you're moving past partial listening skills to more active or effective listening.
Yeah. And I think you've seen us do this before. And that is, you listen for however long and the person is done. And then you give them a little period of time to make certain they're done. And then you respond. And if you can respond back in a minute and summarize what they said, great. How about half a minute? How about 21 words? And you've seen me do this. How about 12 words?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it caused quite the friction when we introduced that at our company. They're like, how am I supposed to do that? And this was a table of seasoned executives.
Right. But eventually they got to the point where they were summarizing each other's conversation in 12 words or less. And they had some fun with it. And to start with, it caused significant consternation. But it's an interesting question for our BrainWise listeners. At any point in time, can you just summarize what they said in 21 words or less?
Right.
It's a neat little trick. And if you get into that level of practice, then it actually feeds on itself because you start to pay much more attention.
Exactly.
So this first level is, I can relate to this. I know the answer to this. I know how to fix this. And if you're moving a little bit towards I'm going to start asking questions, you start worrying whether you're going to ask the best question back or not. And hey, I've learned from Phil and Cole that I should be asking open-ended questions. What's the best open-ended question? If any of our listeners want, we're happy to send them a list of 150 open-ended questions. But again, very briefly, how and why are always good starting points.
And what?
How and what.
Let's talk about why questions might not always land.
Well, why do you think that is?
It sounds a bit accusatory in nature sometimes, or assumptive when you ask why questions. The premise behind them is oftentimes entirely innocent, right? You're just trying to I'm a very much a why person. I want to understand, why do you believe this, whatever. But when I begin to do that, now I'm putting the other person oftentimes immediately on the defensive posture. I need to defend myself versus saying, what's led you to believe those things versus why do you believe that? It comes across very differently.
And so why questions are they're equally powerful, but you've got to treat them with velvet gloves on, because if you make the slightest intonation incorrect, you make the slightest body language incorrect question, hey, why'd you do that? Shaking your head. The implication is, why'd you do that, comma, you jerk?
Right. Why'd you do that? You suck.
Exactly. And so we're not saying don't ever use why questions. Use them judiciously. You can always get to the same end result using a what or a how question.
Right. And I think one of the things, Phil, I'd like to share, when you're asking those questions and you find yourself having difficulty listening, it's not, especially what we just gave you one tip, which is spend time really being intentful on how can I summarize what this person just said in 21 words or less. Another thing that might be helpful is if you're someone who is like for me, for example, I am a very active person in terms of my brain's always moving, my body's always moving. But what I find to be helpful, is there a stress ball that I can squeeze? Is there something that I can put in my hands that doesn't make noise, that allows me to move my fingers, because then I can actually focus on what the other person is saying, because I'm not using it as a form of distraction, but it's actually a way of focusing. And I am sure you have a reason why that is, but I can't pull it out of my head right now, but I know it's a tactic that has worked for me for many years. If I'm in a meeting or if I am trying to really intentfully listen to someone else, I need to have, even if it's just a rubber band that I'm stretching in my hands and I'm mindless, I'm not doing it with any sort of mindful intention. It actually helps me focus on what the other person is saying.
Yeah. And would you like to know the neuroscience of that now?
I would love to, because I'm sure our BrainWise friends would too.
Yeah. So actually what it is, I'm just going to do this in very quick detail. And that is that when you're doing something like that with your hands, your right hand is being guided by the left part of your brain, and your left hand is being guided by the right hand part of your brain. Speech, however, is in the left part of the brain. Listening is distributed over both. But speech and motor skills, the ability to move that part of your hand, are right next door to each other in the brain. And so the active part of getting ready to speak is actually being triggered off by the fact that you're actually moving your hand.
So if you're playing with a rubber band, for example, or a fidget spinner or whatever that doesn't make noise, you're to some degree distracting, I'm using my own layman's terms here, that part of your brain so that you can more intensely listen.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So that's one additional BrainWise tip from an attention perspective. If you find yourself having difficulty with attention, it may not be anything you're doing to be rude or intentionally trying to be rude, but it's just you need to distract yourself with something that allows that part of your brain to focus on the person and what they're saying in front of you.
Yeah. Another little technique, and this probably works better in the workspace than it does in the social space, and that is if you're listening and you're worried about forgetting, which is true for many of us, gain an agreement with the other person. Is it okay to just jot down a couple of notes? Right. I'm doing this not because I'm not paying attention to you. It's actually the opposite. I'm paying more attention, but I'm worried I might forget some of these things as we go through the conversation.
Right.
Also get permission up front. Otherwise, it looks like you're taking note and you're the thought police, and that's not what it's about.
And as much as you might want to use your phone to take notes, this is one place where I'm very digital forward. I'd highly recommend you don't, for the simple fact that it's going to serve as a distraction to actually listening to the conversation. So this is where you pull out your notepad or your sticky note to write down your couple of notes and then take a picture and transfer it to your actual notes section in your digital library, because the phone will actually serve as a distraction, or any device that's connected to the internet and all of the notifications that come in.
So let's move on. Let's look at, okay, we've talked about what goes on. The partial, we call it level 1. It's about yourself. Now we move up to doing things on what we call level 2, which is significant improvement. And that is where you're really focusing on the other person. Your attention is squarely focused on the other person. You're listening to their answers. If it causes a trigger of an idea for you, you're maybe noting, or, hey, I know that's something I should think about. And then you're asking follow-up questions. Hey, what do you mean by, what was the most memorable thing about the road to Hana for you? But you're also asking questions about what we call paraphrasing and clarifying. Paraphrasing, hey, what I heard you said is that one of the most beautiful places in the world is the road to Hana. You didn't actually say that, right? You didn't say it was the most beautiful, but I pushed that in. And typically what we find is, if in that paraphrase process, I come up with an idea that you go, yeah, I actually hadn't thought of it that way, but it really is one of the most beautiful places. So we start moving the conversation again, richer and deeper. So in the process of paraphrasing, we can add other things. What we've also noticed is when people paraphrase, they will often restructure it slightly. And so then the recipient, the person who was originally speaking, goes, oh, I'd never looked at it that way. And in that process of adding in a structure, we can often cause a little aha moment for the person who's actually originally delivering the speech or whatever it was they're doing. So now you're starting to actually add value in to the process. If we get to that point where the other person has a little aha moment, that actually releases a bit of dopamine into their brain, which actually makes them enjoy the conversation more. And therefore, we'll have a richer, more enjoyable conversation.
And I think it's a fabulous exercise. And it certainly helps to further the dialogue. The only kind of caution, I think, is when you're, especially in a conversation with your significant other and you've had a disagreement, we need to paraphrase based off what we believe their true intent, not what we believe their intention is, but what they're communicating to us. Because if we start to say and add on or put a little additional spin, it may indicate that we're not listening to how they actually feel or where they actually are. So paraphrasing in a way that, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying. And then if you do have points of clarity or other ideas or something, then that's where you say, and what that means to me is X, or how I interpret that is this way. So I agree 100%. I think it's, especially when the emotions are higher with our significant other, just being careful to be as close to what they've said in our paraphrasing, and then put a notice or a PSA on the front of, and now here's my interpretation of it.
Yeah. And one of the issues for those of you who attended active listening classes, which many of us have, we delivered them. One of the things that gets people frustrated is if you just use the same structure of response. What I heard you say was blah, 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 blah. And you can do that maybe twice, maybe 3 times. But after that, people want to go, hey, don't be a parrot to me. All I want is an engagement. So that's why asking a clarifying question or paraphrasing, hey, I heard you say it was X, but it sounds to me like, and you, excuse me, use your own verbiage in that, but engage in the conversation in the terms of how do I move this forward and improve it? And again, when you're asking those clarifying questions, paraphrasing questions, follow-up questions, they're about the other person, not about you.
Right.
So that's the second level, when we're focusing on exactly what's going on, and we're using, excuse me, We're using the words, the structure, the topics, and this, that, and the other of the conversation itself. Okay, you ready to go to the masterful level?
I'm ready. I'm curious if I'm even there yet. Or maybe some conversations I am and some I'm not. We'll find out.
And that's a great point. Excuse me a moment. I do need to take a sip.
Sure. Because I'm sure there are some discussions where I do a really good job of listening. I know there are. And then there are others where I know I definitely have opportunity to listen.
Yeah. And there's going to be all sorts of other factors. And part of it is your degree of connectedness, your degree of knowledge. There's one thing about many conversations, we call it the curse of knowledge. If you
Right.
think you know a lot about it, you're less likely to listen.
Yeah.
So let's move on to masterful level. And that is when you're actually looking and you're listening about other things. You're listening to the impact that you're having on the other person. So if am I actually engaging is sufficient? Are we making eye contact? Are they looking over their shoulder? Are they not interested in even talking to me about what they're passionate about? What are they not saying? Winston Churchill was really good at, when he was presenting, using the silences between his words, even and between the sentences. But what's not being said? What are their gestures? What's the body language they're using? I actually had someone phone me up yesterday, and I won't give any names here, but he said, I was talking to this couple and I asked them how they were doing, and they said, we're doing great. And he said it was very clear that was not the case. I said to him, so what was the clarity about that you picked up on? And he just basically said their body language didn't match the words they were saying. So that's another level. That's when you're starting to get into the mastery. And then it depends on the relationship you have with that individual, the type of question you can go. If you have a really good relationship with them, you can literally turn around and say, hey, doesn't sound like that's the case.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of things that you can respond, which show what we talked about the other day, empathy.
And I think one of the things that is going to be important when we do that, especially in a relationship, our spouse or whatever, because we do pick up on a lot and we spend a ton of time with your significant other. It's when you're on the receiving end. So if someone goes, hey, it doesn't seem, obviously there's a gentle approach, right? Or a gentle start to that dialogue. When your spouse or your significant other says that to you, instead of going, because a lot of times I've seen this where people will become immediately in the defensive posture. I'm not feeling that way. That doesn't mean any of that, which then just further indicates that we probably hit on some form of truth. Because typically we don't defend things that are untrue, right? Not always, but typically. And so remind yourself to say, okay, let me think, where may it be coming from? And you may be showing up in a way that is entirely unrelated to the person that's in front of you, but because of a variety of things that have happened at your workday or whatever that you've not yet communicated, and it's causing you to show up in a way with your significant other that is unintended. And so then take that moment to go, okay, yeah, I didn't realize that. Give me a second. Some things happened at work or whatever, but always remember, especially if it's your spouse or your partner, their intentions are to get to know you. Obviously, maybe some people are in a more of a struggle situation, but that most of the time they have positive intention. Believe the positive intention that they have, because if you think about it from that perspective, it oftentimes lessens the defensiveness that comes out.
Yep. So let's do a quick summary. And that is, so we've talked about what I call the spectrum of listening, which ranges from ignoring somebody to masterful listening. And so those are I've actually got it in my head 6 points on that journey. We've talked about acknowledging back what you heard. We've talked about validating. Yes, I've heard that. We talked about expanding upon it, seeking clarity. And we talked about checking in. Hey, this is what I heard. Did I get that right? And those are all part, although physically they are a response and they're speaking, but they're part of the listening. We talked about the biological dance of listening. And so talking and telling and asking questions are all part of that dance. But I want to move us one step deeper. Is that okay?
I would love to.
And that is, we talked about listening. What's actually influencing the act of listening inside your brain? All right. And we've identified at least 8 things.
Yep.
And there's probably more. But one is when somebody says something, it triggers off a whole series. All of our cues that come in generate emotions, feelings, thoughts, and subsequently a response. So if somebody is describing something to you which is exciting, then you're going to have a certain set of feelings and thoughts about it, and emotions. If somebody's describing something to you which is not so lovely, then you have a different set of emotions and thoughts. So those are going through, and they're going to change your ability to actually control your response. We've mentioned a couple of times already in this discussion. So that was the first one, your emotions, feelings, and thoughts. The second one is we've talked about mental models. We all listen through filters, mental models, biases, and they are going to, in addition to missing some of the things that are communicated with us, we're now filtering some stuff out based on the conceptualizations and the inference, as opposed to what was actually said. Then we've talked a little bit about this in the past. We're not one cohesive character. So how you're going to respond to the same words on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock is probably different than how you're going to respond at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when you're tired at the end of the day.
Right.
So you've got those 4 things. You've got your own personal threat profile. What are the topics that threaten you? So although somebody might be genuinely talking to you about something passionate about, it may actually put you in a threat state. And now how are you going to respond? The next level is, what's your own stress level? What's going on in your life? Are you worried about trying to get home because you've locked the cat and the cat's outside and up the tree? Who knows? The next level is, what's the relationship and trust level that you have with that person? If you have a high degree of relationship with them, that you're in a good relationship, a high degree of trust, you can actually respond with questions that might not be appropriate if you didn't have that level of trust. And the last one is what I call neurodiverse tendencies. If you are naturally inclined to be introverted, it might be more difficult for you to enter into those open-ended questions. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff, and we're going to go into that in a lot more detail at some point in time in the future.
Yeah. But those are some of the things that are barriers to connection. And I think if we think about our own personal experience when we're having a conversation with someone, of those items that you just shared, Phil, where is it that myself, right, or our BrainWise friends, putting ourselves in the position of where one of those barriers may be I am struggling with to really connect with someone else? Is it I'm looking for confirmation? Confirmation bias is coming in. I'm looking for things that confirm what I already believe versus exploring the areas that I may not believe or that I'm not as familiar. That could be one.
Yeah.
Another is, go ahead, Phil. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely. The bias is, we could double click on that one and go into all sorts of things. Are you part of my in-group? I'm more likely to listen to you than if you're part of my out-group. Are you part of an out-group that I actually already have an opinion about, that they are, quotes, wrong or different or whatever it might be? So all of that stuff is all going on in the background. It's a big miasma in there around how do you actually listen and then thoughtfully construct a response.
And for some people, it will take, to overcome these barriers, practice and intention, a high degree of intentionality in conversation. And that's where we talk about how can you, if you're listening to another person, a way to do it is how can I summarize what they're saying in 21 words or less? Or maybe it's a couple more because you're still practicing or whatever, because you're having to acutely listen to the other person, make an understanding of what's happening, and then put it into context so that you can summarize it. And so by actively practicing that in a conversation will, to some degree, help us remove some of these barriers, because if you're acutely aware of what they're saying to that level of detail, it's going to be more challenging for some of these other things to come through in the dialogue. Now, they still could come through in that conversation where you're having confirmation bias or you're filtering what's happening through your own worldview, which is, I think, that becomes really critical when having a conversation with someone is, and they probably intertwine, quite honestly. My worldviews are probably somewhat influenced by my biases and vice versa. If you're listening acutely to what people are saying, it can help distract from those other things playing a part in your ability to listen.
And you mentioned a couple of key words, and I want to zero in on one of them, and that's practice. I'm not a great one for sports analogy, but let's use a sports analogy for a moment. If you find yourself not very good at golf, what do? You go out and practice. You go practice on a golf range. There's a specific place for you to go and practice. So one of many people's mental models is, oh yeah, I heard this from Cole and Phil, therefore I should get good at it very quickly. Doesn't necessarily happen. This all requires practice. If any of our listeners are saying, yeah, I'm going to do some things differently, cut yourself some slack. You're not going to get it perfect. You're not going to get it just right. But if you can notch it up one level every time and maybe find some practice person, a buddy that you can have dialogue practice with.
Right.
Lots of ways, but don't expect that you're going to listen to this for whatever it is, an hour, and then be an expert at listening.
No, you'll probably grab a couple of good tidbits that you can begin to use. And one of the things that I would say is, especially in your relationship, if you're married or you're in a committed, whatever, have a significant other, is if you recognize that after listening to this or just in general that, hey, I need to work on these areas of listening because it's sparking something, I would highly encourage you to have a vulnerable moment and actually share that with your spouse and say, I recognize that I'm having difficulty with active listening or paraphrasing or asking open-ended questions. And my commitment is X. Can you help me along that journey? Because it creates a moment of relatability. If I can be vulnerable with my spouse and say, this is what I recognize that I need to work on, and here's how I'm going to do it and where I might need assistance, it will bring you closer together. Where I think a lot of times people are fearful and they're going, I'm not going to share that because then what are they going to think? All these different things. What are they going to think of me? How are they going to approach me? And then there's also this mental model that if I say that, then that means I'm not a good spouse or I'm not a good partner, or I'm not a good husband or a good wife or whatever. The reality is we're not perfect anyways. So let's take that notion. We're never going to be perfect, never will be perfect. It's just part of the human experience. But we certainly can improve. And by creating relatability and saying, hey, let me be vulnerable and share where I believe I'm really struggling with my ability to listen, it's going to allow your spouse to go, oh my gosh, thank you so much for sharing that, blah, blah, blah. How can I help? And then it'll encourage them to do the same thing. And you'll be surprised by the degree of connection that you have after that because you've been vulnerable and shared a part of where you're still in your growth journey.
And what I would say is ditto all that in the workspace. Because when we've taken people through coaching processes at work, one of the things we recommend is let your team know what you're working on and ask for help. Most people, if you ask them for help, they're very willing to give you.
Absolutely. And it just creates such a relatable moment of human connection because none of us are perfect. We're all working on something. And so by doing that, it does really create this powerful moment of connection with someone else.
Yep. Okay.
So, yeah.
How did we do?
Very good. Phil, let's summarize what we've talked about today, and then let's do our BrainWise moments of the week, or perhaps they're unwise moments.
So let's see. We talked about the 3 aspects of dialogue: asking, telling, and listening. Right. We talked about the spectrum of attention. We talked about how the different layers of listening. The first layer is about yourself. The second layer is basically about others. And then the third is all the other things that are the glue in between, what's not being said and things like that. We talked about the 8 things that are going on in the back of your head that actually will influence whether you've got the ability to keep listening or not.
Phil, what was your BrainWise moment or unwise moment from the week?
So the BrainWise moment was not a very enlightening one, But as some of you might recall, is I showed up at the doctor's last week and was actually the wrong date. So this time I did show up at 7:30 on Monday morning, on time, on the right day.
Woo! I love it. Very good.
And my other
Clean bill of health?
clean bill of health.
Good.
My other BrainWise moment was when we learned on the refrigerator, which we installed just weeks ago, was not only not working, but was not repairable without major effort. When I learned that and I got the call from the representative, I actually had a BrainWise moment that I actually said, what would you do in my situation? And she said, I'd probably ask for a replacement refrigerator. I said, that's exactly what I'm doing.
Amen. I love it. That's good. That's a good one. That's very good. And my BrainWise moment from the week is, if our listeners listened to us last week, they heard that I had several pounds of laundry that I had not folded, and there were wrinkles, and it was frustrating, and it took me 45 minutes to fold them. So that's beside the point. That was my unwise moment. My BrainWise moment is this week I got back on routine. I would say it's a BrainWise half moment, and I'm going to tell you why. I got back on routine. I did the laundry and I folded it as it was coming out. All of that great, no wrinkles, except for one load. But it's okay, because that load in particular, I don't care if there's wrinkles, and that's the towels. So I got a little closer to having a very BrainWise moment of folding everything except for the towel. So there's no wrinkles in the clothes this week, but there might be wrinkles in the towel. So if that bothers someone, my apologies, but didn't get to it this week.
And my suggestion on that is, if that's the worst that happens to you in your life, you're doing okay.
Amen. Very good. Well, that is our episode for today. So I'm going to give our BrainWise friends, Phil, just a few points of reflection or reflection questions to think about as we go along our journey of becoming even more effective listeners from a neuroscience perspective. And we talked about the art of dialogue. There's 3 components of it: barriers to connection. We talked about the attention spectrum. So here are the questions. So pick a couple. We've given some BrainWise tips along this journey, but here are a couple reflection questions that you can think on as you go about your next week on where you might be in your ability to listen. So in your last disagreement, were you protecting your point or protecting connection? When someone talks to you, how do you know they're really listening? What's one distraction you can remove to make your attention a gift this week? I absolutely love that question, because attention is such a gift to the other person. How does your body tell when you're starting to get defensive? And can you catch it early on? And who in your life deserves more of your curiosity than your correction? I absolutely love that last question too. Part of it might be indicating where I'm going to reflect this week as we go along our journey. But that's our episode today on the art and science of effective dialogue. We're so glad that you continue to come along this BrainWise journey with us. If you enjoyed today's episode, we encourage you to comment, subscribe, share our podcast with others in your circle, both personally and professionally, so they too can begin to go along this journey with you and with us. And even if, it's just something that you found really interesting, like, comment, share, subscribe, review our podcast, because it helps others find us. And we want to continue to build on this community of BrainWise listeners. And if you have questions or comments, always send them in to questions@mybrainwisecoach.com. And until next week, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brain.